The silence on the 14th floor was suffocating. I returned to find two HR reps and the CEO's arrogant son hovering over my open desk drawers. Barrett smirked, pulling a slim black graphite token from my locked compartment. He assumed he held the keys to our entire network. He had no idea he was holding a legal grenade. I didn't yell. I just asked, "Who signed the chain of custody exception to touch that sealed item?" "My name is Reese Wallace. I am 37 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have engineered the circulatory system of Caldwell Meridian Logistics." When I stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor after a grueling 45-minute briefing with the supplier audit team, the first thing that hit me was the acoustics. A logistics operations floor is never quiet. It is a living, breathing organism of ringing desk phones, sharp keyboard clacking, and voices projecting over cubicle walls to verify shipping manifests. You get used to the white noise of millions of dollars moving across state lines, but on this specific Tuesday morning, the air was entirely dead. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, suffocating, the kind of acoustic vacuum that precedes a physical shockwave. As I walked down the long central aisle lined with gray partitions, the symphony of daily commerce ground to a complete and unnatural halt. Conversations snapped shut mid-sentence. Dozens of my colleagues suddenly found their dual monitors utterly fascinating. Their postures went rigid, shoulders hunched as if they were trying to shrink into the fabric of their ergonomic mesh chairs. A few eyes darted my way, nervous, deeply apologetic glances that flicked away the second I caught them. Everyone on the floor knew exactly what was happening. Everyone except me. I slowed my pace, the soles of my sensible leather heels sinking into the low-pile corporate carpet, each step feeling louder than it should. My workspace was located at the far end of the executive bullpen, a strategic position I had chosen that allowed me to monitor the floor while maintaining a clear line of sight to the glass-walled boardrooms. But my line of sight was currently blocked. A small barricade of bodies had formed around my desk. I recognized the cast of characters instantly, and the specific combination of them sent a cold, clinical thrill of adrenaline through my veins. There were two representatives from Human Resources. One was Celia Marsh, a senior director whose entire career consisted of nodding at the right times and protecting the executive suite from liability. Beside her was a junior associate I only knew by sight, looking entirely out of his depth. Standing behind them, arms crossed over his thick chest to project intimidation, was one of our building security guards. And leaning casually against the edge of my desk, as if he were waiting for a barista to hand him a coffee, was Barrett Sloan. Barrett was the son of Conrad Sloan, our chief executive officer. Less than 2 months ago, Barrett had been anointed as the executive vice president of strategy. It was a title fabricated entirely out of thin air, bestowing immense executive authority upon a man who had never built a single functional process in his entire life. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than most people on this floor made in 3 months, and he possessed the effortless, relaxed posture of a man who believed the world was simply an extension of his birthright. He didn't look angry, he looked vaguely entertained, enjoying the spectacle he had created. I stopped a few feet away, my eyes bypassing the people entirely to scan my workstation. When you design high-stakes supply chain architectures, your brain is permanently wired to detect anomalies in any system. My desk was my sanctuary, meticulously organized to reflect the highly structured nature of my work. Now, it was a crime scene of minor, deliberate violations. My leather-bound notebook, which I always aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the keyboard, was sitting at a careless 45-degree angle. The color-coded internal project folders I kept in the wire rack had been thumbed through, their edges slightly misaligned and dog-eared. My laptop lid was open, the screen glowing with the standard company lock interface, but the mouse was pushed entirely to the left side of the pad. They had been digging, turning over the physical manifestations of my work, but the untouched state of the keyboard told me a crucial story. They were afraid to actually try and breach the digital system itself. They wanted physical leverage. They were searching for a vulnerability they could hold in their hands. What exactly is going on here? I asked. My voice was perfectly even, pitched at a conversational volume that somehow carried flawlessly in the deadened, tense room. Celia from Human Resources shifted her weight nervously, her manicured fingers clutching a standard-issue clipboard against her chest like a plastic shield. "Reese," she started, using that practiced, overly empathetic tone specifically designed by corporate management to de-escalate hostile terminations. "This is just a routine compliance audit of executive workspaces. Standard procedure for the end of the quarter." I looked at Celia, holding her gaze until she blinked, then shifted my eyes to the broad-shouldered security guard blocking the aisle, and finally to Barrett. A routine audit did not require an armed physical escort. A routine audit did not stop the entire 14th floor from working. The lie was so transparent it was bordering on insulting to my intelligence. Barrett didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Just crossing our T's and dotting our I's, Reese," he said smoothly, relishing the sound of his own voice. "Corporate hygiene. You know how the board of directors gets about localized physical documents and off-network data? We just need to make sure everything is exactly where it belongs." It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. He stood there wielding his father's surname like a loaded weapon, dressing up a blatant, targeted abuse of power as standard company protocol. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to throw a fit, to snatch my folders back, to yell about my rights, to give him a documented reason to tell the entire floor that Reese Wallace was unstable, overly territorial, and insubordinate. This wasn't a compliance audit. It was a public execution of my authority, carefully orchestrated in broad daylight to show the entire executive tier that no one, not even the principal architect of their most profitable logistics systems, was untouchable by the Sloan family. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly at my sides, projecting an aura of absolute, impenetrable boredom. "I see," I replied simply, letting the two words hang in the air. The junior human resources rep, sweating slightly under his starched collar, was crouching near the bottom right pedestal of my desk. It was the only drawer I kept permanently locked. It didn't hold company financial records, stolen client lists, or proprietary source code. It held the infrastructure keys. I watched in silence as the junior rep awkwardly manipulated a generic master skeleton key into the steel cylinder. The lock clicked with a sharp snap. He pulled the heavy metal drawer open. The metallic scrape echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. He reached inside, pushed aside a few spare pens, and rummaged for a second before his hand emerged holding something small and unassuming. He stood up slowly and placed it squarely on the glass surface of my desk. It was a thin, rectangular object forged from heavy, black graphite. It caught the harsh fluorescent overhead light with a dull, matte, non-reflective finish. It looked somewhat like a high-end, military-grade authentication token or a biometric key drive, but it lacked any identifying markers whatsoever. There was no Caldwell Meridian Logistics logo etched into its surface. There was no inventory barcode, no serial number, nothing at all to indicate it belonged to the company paying our salaries. Barrett's eyes lit up with predatory recognition. He pushed off the edge of the desk, his fake nonchalance slipping just enough to reveal the raw greed underneath his tailored suit. He thought he had found the smoking gun. He thought he had just uncovered my secret stash of leverage, the hidden master key to the digital kingdom he so desperately wanted to rule without knowing how to build it. He reached out his hand to take it. I didn't lunge forward to stop him. I didn't raise my hand to block his reach. I didn't let a single ounce of panic or anger bleed into my facial expression. Instead, I let the silence stretch out for one more painful, agonizing second. Then, I spoke. My voice was scarcely louder than a whisper, yet it cut through the thick, suffocating tension of the 14th floor with the lethal precision of a surgical blade. "Who signed the chain of custody exception to touch that sealed item?" The effect was instantaneous. It wasn't a defensive question. It wasn't a plea or an emotional outburst. It was the cold, hard vocabulary of extreme, uncompromising legal liability. Celia froze instantly, her hand hovering midway to her clipboard, her breath hitching in her throat. The junior human resources rep literally took a stumbled step backward, his eyes widening in sudden, raw panic as he looked from the graphite token to my face. And Barrett Sloan, the arrogant prince of the company, stopped completely dead. His manicured hand halted mere inches from the black graphite token. For one long, distinctly unnatural beat, the arrogant, entitled smirk completely melted off his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine, unadulterated uncertainty. The hunter had just realized he might have stepped blindfolded into a steel trap, and the silence in the room suddenly felt entirely different. I never cared for the corner offices with the panoramic city views or the glossy feature articles in industry logistics magazines. At Caldwell Meridian Logistics, the individuals who spend their time aggressively chasing public credit are usually the exact same individuals who have absolutely no idea how the underlying engine actually functions. Building that engine required sacrificing sleep, personal relationships, and countless weekends over the span of 6 years. I am the lead structural architect behind Lattice Relay. It is far more than just a proprietary software program. It is a sprawling, living ecosystem. It is the central nervous system for emergency supply chain coordination. My dedicated team manages the complex, split-second logistics for massive private hospital networks, independent trauma clinics, and Tier 1 pharmaceutical partners operating across 22 different states. We track refrigerated transport trucks, cargo planes, and secure storage facilities in real time. When a localized disaster hits, we are the sole reason a trauma center situated in a suddenly flooded metropolitan zone does not run out of critical surgical supplies, intravenous fluids, or life-saving blood reserves. It is a highly sensitive infrastructure built on massive server redundancy, absolute data precision, and unforgiving legal protocols. Most of the people currently sitting in the open-plan cubicles around me, holding their breath and pretending not to watch my desk being raided, have no fundamental understanding of what my department actually does on a daily basis. They see my engineers staring at complex routing dashboards filled with scrolling green data and assume we are just another layer of administrative overhead slowing down their lucrative sales pipelines. They only remember my name when their perfectly planned world threatens to completely fall apart. When a Category 4 hurricane unexpectedly shifts course and shuts down the entire eastern seaboard transit network, they look to me. When a massive trucking union strike paralyzes the vital Midwest transit corridors, or when a catastrophic automated inventory routing error threatens to spoil tens of millions of dollars worth of highly regulated, temperature-sensitive medical vaccines, they scramble blindly toward my desk. My team is the absolute only firewall standing between a minor operational hiccup and a multi-million-dollar breach of contract that would trigger catastrophic federal audits and inevitable bankruptcies. We keep the system from collapsing under the weight of unpredictable reality. We do not panic under extreme pressure. We simply execute the disaster protocols. That specific kind of deep structural leverage makes certain ambitious men in executive leadership feel very uncomfortable and profoundly insecure. Barrett Sloan viewed me not as a foundational asset to his father's sprawling corporate empire, but as a deeply irritating, stubborn obstacle to his own unchecked ambition. I did not fit into his narrow, privileged worldview of corporate hierarchy. I was not the type of female employee who would eagerly bow my head, lower my gaze, and cheerfully bypass vital safety protocols simply because the name Sloan was heavily embossed in gold foil on his thick cardstock business cards. The cold tension between us had been quietly simmering since the very first day he was gifted his manufactured executive title, but the conflict finally crystallized into outright, undeniable hostility exactly 3 weeks ago. Nolan Price, our vice president of operations, served as Barrett's most reliable, sycophantic enforcer. Nolan was a man who survived corporate purges by attaching himself to the highest-ranking predator in the room. He sent over a highly irregular digital access memo to my private inbox. He was officially requesting elevated, unrestricted administrative permissions to the Lattice Relay core servers for an unvetted team of external financial contractors. More alarmingly, he specifically asked me to backdate my mandatory digital signature by exactly 14 days. His written justification in the encrypted email was vaguely framed as a necessary and temporary cross-departmental synchronization effort required for an upcoming system audit. It was a blatant, incredibly sloppy attempt to bypass the strict compliance logging system and grant Barrett backdoor access to the platform's core financial routing data. I rejected the request immediately and completely. I did not soften the blow with standard corporate pleasantries or emoji-filled apologies. I did not offer a gentle compromise. I sent a single-line reply flatly denying the authorization and explicitly citing the strict federal regulatory compliance laws governing medical supply chains and secure data integrity. I hit send without a single second of hesitation. From that exact moment, I knew a massive invisible target had been painted squarely on my back. Individuals who are actively maneuvering to illegally hijack operational control harbor a deep, venomous hatred for anyone who demands that signatures be placed in the correct boxes, on the correct dates, and backed by the correct legal authority. Rigid, unbending procedure is the natural, undisputed enemy of the corporate usurper. Barrett was just smart enough to know he could not officially fire me through human resources for strictly following federal compliance laws, so he decided to wage a quiet, insidious, and highly personal war of attrition instead. He began planting toxic seeds of doubt in the executive boardrooms and behind closed, soundproofed doors. He casually mentioned over expensive, company-expensed lunches with the board of directors that I was becoming a dangerous bottleneck to the company's aggressive growth strategy. He actively and maliciously spread the false narrative that I was holding far too much critical operational knowledge exclusively in my head and keeping the system controls far too tightly gripped in my own hands. He deliberately took my strict adherence to professional caution and twisted it into an ugly, painted picture of suspicious, paranoid secrecy. He desperately wanted the upper management layer to believe I was a rogue, uncontrollable element risking the company's lucrative future by refusing to share my operational domain with his new, modernized leadership structure. Therefore, the grotesque theater currently unfolding around my workspace was not a spontaneous decision born out of a sudden desire for workspace cleanliness. It was not a random routine security spot check generated by an algorithm. It was a meticulously calculated, highly visible phase of his active campaign to publicly strip me of my professional credibility and forcefully rip the control of Lattice Relay from my grip. He needed a public spectacle to prove to the entire 14th floor that he could easily bring the untouchable, arrogant systems architect to heel. He wanted to shatter my aura of invulnerability in front of the very team I protected. Back in the heavy, suffocating silence of the present moment, my sharply worded question regarding the chain of custody exception was still hanging thickly in the cold, air-conditioned air. The junior human resources representative stood completely frozen in place, the small, unmarked graphite token resting heavily on his trembling palm like a live, ticking explosive device. He looked sideways at Celia, his eyes silently begging her for an instruction manual on how to handle a situation that was clearly not covered in his corporate orientation packet. Celia's eyes darted nervously toward Barrett. Her throat swallowed hard, visibly bobbing. She knew the federal compliance rules. She knew exactly what breaking a legally sealed digital custody chain meant for our external security ratings and our impending corporate liability. Her brief, terrified hesitation was the loud, unspoken confirmation that they had absolutely zero legal grounding for this forced search. But Barrett's monumental, blinding arrogance easily eclipsed his rudimentary, deeply flawed understanding of severe corporate liability. He looked at the sudden hesitation infecting his own makeshift raiding party and sneered with open, unfiltered disgust. He did not care about the complex, boring legalities of digital custodianship. He only cared about the optics of winning the standoff and asserting his absolute dominance over the room. "I do not need a piece of paper to secure company property," Reese, Barrett stated, his voice dripping with venomous condescension as he stepped forward. With a swift, aggressive, and highly impatient motion, Barrett snatched the heavy graphite token right out of the junior representative's sweating hand. He gripped the black rectangle tightly in his right fist, completely and recklessly ignoring their brief, terrified hesitation as if swatting away a minor, buzzing annoyance. He looked down at me, his chest puffed out with unearned victory, holding the small device like he had just drawn the winning lottery ticket. He truly believed he had finally found the ultimate golden key to permanently eliminate me from the corporate game. He had absolutely no idea what kind of catastrophic, company-ending door he was about to rip wide open. Barrett did not waste a single second lingering at my desk to gloat. He spun on his expensive Italian leather heels and marched straight toward the glass-enclosed central operations room located at the far north end of the floor. He gripped the black graphite token so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. It was the physical manifestation of his hubris. I remained exactly where I was, watching the spectacle unfold from a distance through the soundproof glass partitions. He immediately summoned Nolan Price from his corner office, along with 2 junior infrastructure engineers who had the unfortunate luck of being on shift that afternoon. The central operations room is a climate-controlled fishbowl filled with wall-to-wall monitor banks displaying the real-time health of our entire logistics network. When Barrett and his newly formed raiding party entered, the atmosphere inside shifted from quiet monitoring to aggressive, unchecked ambition. Nolan Price, his vice president of operations, was already running his mouth, inflating the narrative to justify their blatant overreach. Even through the thick glass, I could perfectly read Nolan's frantic, animated body language as he leaned over the main console and pointed aggressively at the screens. "She is definitely hoarding company assets," Nolan declared to the room, his voice a mix of manufactured outrage and desperate sycophancy. "She is trying to bottleneck the core systems to create personal leverage for the upcoming expansion deal with the Palisade Care Alliance. We are talking about a contract worth nearly $900 million. We cannot have a rogue systems architect holding that kind of capital hostage." It was a brilliant, albeit entirely fictional, piece of corporate spin. Nolan was preemptively building a defense, painting me as a saboteur, so their illegal seizure of the token would look like a heroic rescue mission to the board of directors. The 2 young engineers, however, looked physically ill. They were staring intently at the black graphite token Barrett had just slammed onto the console desk next to the primary authentication reader. One of the engineers, a sharp kid fresh out of graduate school, hesitated. He nervously shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting back and forth between the physical token and the biometric scanner. "Sir," the engineer stammered, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "Accessing the lattice relay core infrastructure with an unregistered physical key bypasses standard protocol. Protocol clearly states we need a fully executed legal approval document from the compliance department before we override the primary access logs. I cannot just plug that in without authorization." Barrett leaned heavily over the console, trapping the young engineer between his own physical presence and the glowing screens. He did not yell. He did not need to. He simply weaponized his upbringing. He used the exact patronizing tone of a man who had grown up in country clubs and private schools, a man who had literally never heard the word no applied to his own desires. "Do you know whose name is etched into the marble lobby of this building?" Barrett asked smoothly, his tone dripping with absolute entitlement. "Because I assure you, it is not yours, and it is certainly not hers. I am the Executive Vice President of Strategy. This is my strategy. You will open the system right now, or you will pack your desk into a cardboard box before 3 o'clock. The threat hung heavy and absolute in the sterile air of the operations room. The engineer swallowed hard, his professional ethics crumbling completely under the sheer weight of executive bullying. He nodded slowly, his hands visibly shaking as he reached over and initialized the manual override sequence on the main terminal. Barrett did not even wait for the system prompt to finish loading. With a triumphant, self-satisfied smirk, he picked up the heavy black graphite token and pressed it firmly against the magnetic authentication reader. For exactly 1 second, absolutely nothing happened. There were no blaring alarms. There were no flashing warning lights. The terminal simply sat in a state of quiet, technical processing. That brief, silent void was the most dangerous moment of all, because it falsely convinced every single arrogant man in that room that they had actually won. I watched Barrett's chest swell with pride. I watched Nolan let out a long, relieved breath, already dreaming of the massive year-end bonus he would claim for successfully neutralizing me. They truly believed the graphite token was a simple skeleton key, a secret digital door belonging to the Sloan family empire that they had rightfully reclaimed and mastered. Then, the underlying trap slammed completely shut. The primary operations monitor at the center of the room flickered violently. The soothing, continuous scroll of green transit data, which represented thousands of active medical supply shipments across the country, abruptly stopped moving. The smooth, rhythmic pulse of the logistics system died instantly. In its place, the entire screen flashed a stark, aggressive white, completely washing out the ambient lighting in the room. The two engineers lunged at their keyboards, their fingers flying across the keys in a desperate panic, but the system refused to acknowledge their physical inputs. The live coordination flows were completely frozen in place. The main access logs, which track every single digital movement within the network, violently switched their status from active to highly restricted. Deeply nested contract reconciliation files, the very documents required to verify active shipments and process external billing, simply vanished from the standard display areas as if they had been erased from existence. The digital architecture of Lattice Relay was rapidly folding in on itself, pulling the drawbridge up and locking the heavy iron gates. A massive bold red warning banner dropped down from the top of the main screen, bleeding across all four adjacent monitors. The text was large, clinical, and completely unforgiving. Custodial quarantine initiated. The smug satisfaction vanished from Barrett's face, replaced instantly by a pale, hollow look of utter confusion. Nolan, who had been leaning casually against the desk just moments before, suddenly stood bolt upright, his eyes wide and fixed on the blazing red letters. The engineers were frantically pulling up diagnostic panels, but every single window they opened was immediately slammed shut by the automated security protocols. "What did you do?" Barrett demanded, his voice finally cracking, losing its polished country club veneer. "Turn it back on. Refresh the user interface." "I am locked out," the young engineer replied, his voice pitching an octave higher in pure terror. "We are all completely locked out. The administrative privileges have been revoked at the root level." Less than 2 minutes later, the true scale of the catastrophe materialized on a secondary monitor. A new alert popped up, specifically targeting the staging environment for our biggest upcoming expansion. The engineers read the alert and physically recoiled from the desk in horror. They realized the release build for the Palisade Care Alliance package was now fully cryptographically locked. That single action meant the company was no longer just dealing with an internal system glitch. If that specific deployment package was not restored to its exact, standardized state before the contractual deadline, Caldwell Meridian Logistics would immediately lose the entire $900 million contract. Furthermore, the breach of the service level agreement would trigger a massive, punitive financial penalty that could easily bankrupt the division and send shockwaves through the entire corporate structure. Nolan tried to fake a sense of calm, desperately smoothing down the lapels of his suit jacket while his hands trembled. "It is fine," Nolan lied through his teeth, his voice shaking noticeably. "It is just a localized security tripwire. We will call the vendor. We will get it reset. Everything is perfectly fine." But as I watched them through the glass, trapped like rats in their own self-made disaster, I knew the absolute truth. From the exact moment that Red Banner dropped, this was no longer a petty desk audit designed to humiliate me. This was no longer a localized power struggle over a locked drawer. Their blind, unchecked arrogance had just transformed a simple grab for power into a fatal operational mistake, one completely capable of igniting a full-scale, company-wide crisis that would burn everything they touched straight to the ground. Less than 3 minutes after the system went into total lockdown, the intercom on my desk crackled to life. It was Nolan, and his voice was completely stripped of its usual slick, practiced corporate polish. Instead, he sounded breathless, barking an order with the specific, aggressive cadence of a man desperately trying to mask his own rising panic. He demanded I report to the central operations room immediately to fix what he referred to as my little technical malfunction. They had orchestrated a public spectacle to humiliate me, and now, having stepped blindly onto a landmine, they expected me to casually stroll in and disarm it for them. I did not rush. I stood up from my chair, smoothed an invisible crease from my tailored skirt, and walked across the 14th floor at my exact normal pace. The heavy silence that had plagued the bullpen earlier had fractured into a tense, whispering, nervous energy. Every single head turned to watch me walk down the central aisle. They knew something catastrophic had happened behind the glass walls of the operations room, and they knew I was being summoned to face the firing squad. When I pushed open the heavy, soundproofed glass door and stepped into the room, the environmental shift was jarring. The climate controls were still functioning perfectly, pumping chilled air into the enclosed space, yet the room felt suffocatingly hot. The ambient lighting, usually a calm, cool blue designed to reduce eye strain for the engineering team, had been entirely overpowered by the harsh, aggressive red glare bleeding from all 6 primary wall monitors. They parted immediately to give me a clear path to the main console. Barrett was standing rigid near the center desk, his expensive Italian suit suddenly looking a size too large for his deflating posture. He was still clutching the black graphite token in his right hand, holding it awkwardly away from his body, as if it were a highly radioactive isotope. The 2 junior engineers were frozen in their ergonomic chairs, their hands hovering completely uselessly over keyboards that the system had aggressively locked them out of. I did not sit down at an available terminal. I did not reach out to take the mouse or furiously tap at the keys to run a diagnostic check. I simply stood in the dead center of the room, my hands resting lightly at my sides, and calmly read the massive warning banners illuminating the screens. The cascading error logs and the bold text declaring the custodial quarantine painted a perfectly clear, legally binding picture. "Well?" Barrett demanded. He tried to inject his usual aristocratic authority into the word, but it came out thin and reedy. "Type in your administrative override password and get this grid back online. We have the Palisade expansion package sitting in the deployment queue, and we do not have the time or the patience for your petty, territorial security games." I turned my head slowly to look at him, allowing my expression to remain utterly blank. "There is no administrative override password," I stated, my voice kept at a low conversational volume. "And I did not lock the system." Nolan stepped forward, his face flushed an angry mottled crimson. "Do not stand there and play dumb with us. Wallace, we plugged in your hidden master key to run a standard vulnerability check, and the entire routing grid instantly froze. This is obviously your personal failsafe. You rigged the architecture to protect your own fiefdom." "That is exactly where your foundational logic falls apart," I replied, gesturing with a slight nod toward the object Barrett was gripping. "Because that object you stole from my desk is not a master key. It is a custody token." They stared back at me with blank, uncomprehending expressions. The sheer depth of their technical ignorance was staggering, but their complete lack of legal awareness was the truly fatal flaw. A master key is a basic authorization tool designed to grant unilateral, unrestricted access to a single user. I explained slowly, deliberately enunciating every single syllable as if I were lecturing a room full of exceptionally slow undergraduate students. "That heavy graphite token you are holding is a physical authentication device bound to a very strict, legally enforced digital escrow protocol. It is never, under any circumstances, designed to open the core system from an internal network node." I took 2 steps closer to the main console, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the quarantine activity log scrolling rapidly on the far left monitor. "That token is simply one half of a mandatory 2-witness verification system," I continued, holding the room in absolute silence. It is exclusively meant to be utilized during a verified catastrophic continuity event. Furthermore, it must be paired simultaneously with a matching cryptographic token held by a bonded, independent third-party auditor. When you pried open my locked drawer, confiscated that device without a valid legal hold, and blindly pressed it against an internal biometric scanner on a standard employee workstation, you did not unlock a secret administrative door. You essentially fired a flare gun inside a powder keg. The younger engineer, the one who had been bullied into swiping the token, let out a soft, horrified gasp. He finally understood the brutal architecture of the trap they had eagerly sprung on themselves. "The protocol thought we were being hijacked from the inside," he whispered, his face draining of all remaining color. "Exactly," I confirmed, never taking my eyes off Barrett. "The security protocol recognized an unauthorized, unilateral attempt to seize root control using a dormant continuity key. Because the request originated from an internal IP address, without the simultaneous external authorization, the system did exactly what I engineered it to do when faced with a hostile internal threat. It instantly severed all active external connections, encrypted the live routing data, and initiated an absolute lockdown to protect the integrity of the medical supply network." Barrett's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering angrily in his cheek. He threw the graphite token down onto the desk surface. It landed with a heavy, dull thud. "Unlock it right now," he ordered, abandoning any pretense of corporate procedure. "It is my network. It belongs to my family. I am officially ordering you to reverse this quarantine." "I cannot do that," I stated simply. "And even if I possess the technical capability to reverse the lockdown from this room, I absolutely do not have the legal authority to do so." Nolan threw his hands up in the air, a gesture of pure, exasperated disbelief. "What in the world are you talking about? You built the entire platform. You are the lead systems architect." "I am the architect," I agreed, my tone remaining as cool as the server room exhaust. "But Caldwell Meridian Logistics does not hold the sole keys to the kingdom anymore. Full operational control of this infrastructure has been legally bound to an external escrow agreement for the past 18 months. The silence that immediately followed my statement was absolute and suffocating. It was the distinct sound of three ambitious men simultaneously realizing the floor had just dropped completely out from underneath them. The automated quarantine protocol you just triggered instantly transferred temporary operational guardianship to Iron Veil Fiduciary and Wallace Continuity Partners Limited Liability Company, I explained, letting the heavy corporate names land squarely in the center of the room. "They are the legally appointed custodians under the disaster recovery contingency terms." Barrett looked as though he had been physically struck across the face. "That is completely illegal," he sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "This is our proprietary software. It is company property. You cannot just hand our critical assets over to some shadow shell company without board approval." "Wallace Continuity Partners is not a shell company," I corrected him smoothly, shutting down his rising hysteria. "It is the independent risk management entity mandated by your own board of directors, and you are tragically confusing asset ownership with operational control. They are not always the same thing." I took one final step toward Barrett, forcing him to meet my unwavering gaze. He tried to maintain his posture, but I could see the sheer panic swimming in his eyes. 18 months ago, during the third refinancing round, the primary external investors realized this company was exactly one bad server crash away from completely losing its entire logistics portfolio. They demanded a neutral, third-party failsafe. They demanded a rigid system where a rogue executive could not accidentally, or maliciously, destroy the core infrastructure to cover up their own mistakes. They demanded an airtight escrow agreement. I slowly let my eyes drift away from him, looking at the blazing red warning banners still flashing relentlessly across the monitors, bathing all of our faces in the color of an emergency. "The company absolutely owns the intellectual property. Barrett," I concluded, my voice dropping to a near whisper that commanded the entire room, But until the formal custody investigation is entirely resolved, and until the third-party auditors are completely satisfied that the internal threat has been fully neutralized, the company no longer possesses the legal right to drive the car. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not gloat. I simply delivered the brutal reality of their situation with cold, clinical precision. As I stood there amidst the glowing red screens, the power dynamic in the room fundamentally and permanently shifted. For the very first time since they had ambushed my desk, the men standing around the console were no longer looking at me like an insubordinate employee caught in a lie. They were looking at me with absolute, undisguised terror. They finally understood that I was not the victim of their corporate raid. I was the only person in the entire building who comprehended the massive, catastrophic yield of the bomb they had just eagerly detonated with their own hands. The heavy glass doors of the central operations room swung open, and Marcus Thorne, the head of internal corporate counsel, walked in. The blinding red light from the quarantine monitors washed over his sharp features, highlighting the deep creases of worry on his forehead. The system had automatically paged the legal department the exact second the external escrow breach was detected. Marcus did not look at the glowing screens. He looked at the heavy graphite token resting on the console, then at Barrett, and finally at me. There was no point defending myself to a room that had already decided what it wanted to believe. I turned to Marcus and spoke in the clinical, detached tone of an auditor. "Marcus," I said smoothly, cutting through the thick, panicked breathing of the men around me. "Before anyone touches another keyboard, I require 3 specific items to be produced immediately. First, I need the formally executed written authorization for the search of my workspace. Second, I need the exact legal foundation justifying the physical seizure of a digitally sealed, legally bound continuity object. And third, I want the name of the specific individual who formally initiated this entire request." Marcus frowned, his lawyer's instincts immediately sensing the massive liability trap yawning open beneath his feet. He turned his attention to Celia Marsh. The Human Resources Director had scurried into the room right behind him, clutching her plastic clipboard against her chest like a protective shield. "Celia," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a dangerous professional register, "please hand me the physical search warrant and the compliance approvals." Celia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her manicured fingers trembled violently against the edge of her clipboard. She looked at Barrett, desperately waiting for him to step in and offer the protective umbrella of his family name. But Barrett was currently staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the realization of his own catastrophic error. "I do not have the physical paperwork with me," Celia finally stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Barrett simply told me we needed to conduct a rapid compliance audit of her desk. He said it was a verbal executive directive." The atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The intoxicating rush of absolute power that Barrett had been riding all morning instantly evaporated, replaced by the freezing, undeniable reality of a severe procedural violation. Marcus stared at Celia with a look of pure, unfiltered professional horror. Conducting a forced search of a senior executive's workspace based entirely on a spoken whim was a massive breach of corporate policy, let alone breaking into a locked drawer to seize an unidentified device. Celia began to breathe rapidly, her eyes darting around the room as the terrifying realization washed over her. She knew that if this incident progressed to a formal external review by the board of directors, her name would be stamped at the top of the compliance violation report. She had permitted herself to be manipulated as a mere pawn, and presently, she was the sole person left facing the disastrous aftermath. I chose to increase the psychological pressure by the slimmest margin. It was a quiet escalation, yet it proved absolutely devastating. "This was never a routine audit," I stated, shifting my gaze directly onto Nolan Price. "This was a desperate, sloppy attempt to forcefully extract access credentials because I refused to hand them over willingly. A few weeks ago, Nolan sent me a formal request demanding unrestricted administrative access to the core routing infrastructure. Furthermore, he explicitly asked me to backdate my digital authorization signature." Nolan flinched as if I had thrown a physical punch at him, His face morphed into a mask of aggressive, desperate denial. "That is an absolute lie," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I never asked you to falsify any documents. You are making wild accusations to cover up the fact that you just locked the entire company out of its own platform." I did not raise my voice to match his panic. "I do not make accusations, Nolan. I keep meticulous records. If Marcus formally requests it, the Information Technology Department can easily pull the archived message from my encrypted inbox. You sent it exactly 18 days ago at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You used the exact phrase, 'need a cleaner path before diligence review.' You were actively trying to create an illegal, undocumented shortcut into the financial routing data right before the independent auditors arrived to evaluate the upcoming expansion deal." Marcus pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket and began writing furiously, his pen digging hard into the paper. The phrase I had quoted was legally damning. It proved intent to bypass regulatory oversight. Just then, the head of physical security stepped into the room, looking deeply uncomfortable. Marcus immediately turned to him and demanded to know which security protocol authorized the forced entry into my locked pedestal drawer. The security lead swallowed hard, avoiding my eyes entirely. He confessed that absolutely no official ticket had been filed in the system. There was no legal hold placed on my desk. There was no documented investigation. His guard had simply been ordered by Barrett to bring a master skeleton key to the 14th floor. The entire raid had zero legal foundation holding it up. "Barrett," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet now. "You cannot simply order a raid on a senior architect's office without cause. What exactly prompted you to initiate this action today?" Barrett swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "We received a tip," he lied, though the lie sounded incredibly weak even to his own ears. "An anonymous internal whistleblower submitted a complaint this morning stating that she was hoarding unauthorized physical drives in her desk. I was simply acting to protect the company's intellectual property." "An anonymous tip," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. I turned back to the young engineer, who was still sitting frozen at the main console. "Since the core system is quarantined, your terminal should still have full access to the internal network diagnostics. Pull up the incoming traffic logs for the internal reporting portal for this morning. Trace the origin Internet Protocol address of that specific anonymous submission." Nolan lunged forward, his hands reaching out as if he could physically stop the engineer from touching the keyboard. But Marcus stepped firmly in his path, holding up a strict hand to block him. The young engineer, desperate to prove his compliance to the legal department after breaking protocol earlier, let his fingers fly across the keys. A black diagnostic window popped up on his screen, lines of white code scrolling rapidly. "The submission came in at 8 o'clock this morning," the engineer reported, his voice shaking slightly as he read the data aloud to the room. But it did not come from an external proxy or a hidden network. It originated from an internal secondary account. "Whose account?" Marcus demanded. The engineer looked up, his face completely pale. "It is a temporary utility account assigned directly to the operations management group. Specifically, a subnet registered to Nolan Price." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. The final layer of the lie had just been brutally peeled away. Nolan was no longer just an ambitious vice president standing on the sidelines cheering for Barrett's power play. The digital footprint proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Nolan had maliciously fabricated the anonymous tip himself. He had engineered the entire crisis, creating a completely fraudulent reason to justify the illegal seizure of the custody token from my possession. He had manipulated Barrett's arrogance to execute his own dirty work. Marcus Thorne closed his notepad with a sharp, decisive snap that echoed loudly in the tense room. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just been handed a massive, explosive disaster that he now had to contain. "Do not touch anything else on these consoles," Marcus ordered the room, his voice radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. He looked directly at the young engineer. "I want an immediate, comprehensive freeze placed on all internal servers." locked down every single email account, every instant messaging log, every security camera file, and every physical access record generated over the last 30 days for both Barrett Sloan and Nolan Price. Barrett let out a strangled gasp, his eyes widening in pure horror. He finally realized that the witch hunt he had so eagerly launched against me had just violently reversed its course. By blindly forcing the system to defend itself, and by leaving a trail of sloppy, arrogant mistakes in their wake, Barrett and Nolan had just handed the legal department everything they needed to launch a full-scale, formal corporate investigation against them. The trap they had built for me had just snapped completely shut around their own necks. The heavy glass doors of the central operations room swung open with such force that they shuddered on their steel hinges. The frantic, nervous energy that had been violently bouncing off the walls completely flatlined in an instant. Conrad Sloan had arrived. As the chief executive officer of Caldwell Meridian Logistics, Conrad possessed the kind of immense, suffocating gravity that naturally sucked the oxygen out of any space he occupied. He was a man in his late 60s who still wore bespoke, sharply tailored suits that armored his broad shoulders like a military uniform. He walked past the panicked junior engineers, completely ignoring Marcus Thorne from the legal department, and bypassed his own son without offering a single glance. He marched straight across the room and stopped directly in front of me. Conrad operated under the permanent, unshakable assumption that every single corporate crisis was simply a matter of a subordinate employee making things far more complicated than strictly necessary. He looked at the blazing red quarantine warnings flashing across the 6 primary wall monitors, then let his cold, gray eyes settle heavily on my face. He did not ask if I was physically all right. He did not acknowledge the fact that his own executive leadership team had just orchestrated a legally baseless, hostile raid on my private workspace. He simply placed me in the familiar patronizing role of the blue-collar mechanic who was stubbornly refusing to fix his broken luxury vehicle. "Reese," Conrad said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble specifically calibrated to command absolute, unquestioning obedience. "Tell me exactly what you need to open the system back up right now. Do you need more server allocation? Do you need an emergency budget override? Name it. We have a massive business to run, and I absolutely do not have the time or the patience for theatrical office politics today." I did not soften my posture. I did not offer the deferential, submissive nod he was so universally accustomed to receiving from everyone on the executive floor. "I cannot open the system, Conrad," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional inflection. "And this current situation is not a product of petty office politics. This is the direct, unavoidable result of a catastrophic internal breach of our external escrow agreement. It is an airtight, legally binding agreement that was firmly established during the corporate refinancing round exactly 18 months ago," Conrad scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed in the tense room. He waved his large hand in the air, as if he were batting away a minor, irritating insect. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation. I alone decide what agreements we honor and when we override them for the sake of operational continuity. If you built a hidden backdoor into this architecture to protect your own department, I am formally ordering you to use it right now." Before I could verbally dismantle his dangerously outdated, archaic understanding of modern corporate governance, Marcus Thorne stepped cleanly into the dead center of the confrontation. The head of internal corporate counsel was clutching his digital tablet tightly, the screen brightly glowing with a freshly pulled compliance file from the legal archives. "Actually, Conrad, she cannot override the quarantine protocol," Marcus stated. His tone was carefully neutral, but it was laced with a heavy, undeniable undertone of legal warning. "And you absolutely cannot order her to do so." Conrad finally tore his attention away from me and turned his cold glare toward his head lawyer, his eyes narrowing dangerously under his thick brows. "Excuse me. Reese is entirely correct regarding the legal framework," Marcus continued, tapping the glass screen of his tablet and turning it so Conrad could clearly read the dense digital document. This is the primary security addendum drafted during the Series C capitalization round. The external institutional investors strictly required a foolproof, automated contingency structure. They demanded a system specifically designed to protect the core client contracts against any unauthorized internal access or hostile operational takeover by our own management, Conrad sneered, leaning in slightly to look at the glowing screen. I never approved a digital infrastructure that could legally lock me out of my own proprietary network. With all due respect, sir, you absolutely did, Marcus countered quietly, his finger pointing to the bottom of the digital page. Look closely at the final paragraph on page 42. Those are your own verified digital initials. You personally signed off on the exact disaster recovery protocol that your son and your vice president of operations just blindly triggered. I watched Barrett out of the corner of my eye. For his entire privileged life, Barrett had relied heavily on the absolute, impenetrable shield of his father's authority to instantly erase his mistakes. He was standing near the console, desperately waiting for Conrad to yell, to threaten to fire Marcus, to somehow warp reality through sheer, brute executive force, but Conrad did not yell. The chief executive officer's eyes slowly tracked across the illuminated legal text on the tablet. His breathing grew shallow. His broad, armored shoulders grew noticeably rigid. He began scrolling down the document, and the speed of his reading drastically decreased. Barrett swallowed hard, a visible pulse hammering erratically in his throat. He saw his father slow down. He recognized that specific, terrifying hesitation. It was the crushing realization that inherited family prestige and a loud, demanding voice were completely useless weapons against ironclad, externally audited contract law. There is a secondary, far more critical issue. Conrad, I interjected, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room so they could all feel the final, crushing weight of the situation. And it is far more severe than a temporary operational freeze on our logistics floor. Conrad slowly lifted his eyes from the tablet. The arrogant irritation on his face had been fully replaced by a guarded, sinking apprehension. Explain the issue. The Palisade Care Alliance expansion is not just another lucrative shipping contract, I stated clearly, laying out the financial reality bare. It is the foundational asset for our entire corporate valuation heading into the upcoming Series D funding round. The external institutional investors are basing our multi-billion-dollar multiplier exclusively on the successful, uninterrupted deployment of that specific medical network integration. If Lattice Relay remains in a state of custodial quarantine at midnight tonight, we automatically and legally default on the master service level agreement. The color drained completely from Conrad's face, leaving him looking suddenly old and deeply tired. If we default at midnight, I continued ruthlessly, refusing to look away from him, the Palisade Care Alliance has the contractual, unquestionable right to terminate the entire expansion package without paying a single penalty. If that happens, our market valuation does not just take a minor temporary dip, it will completely plummet to the absolute bottom. We are talking about permanently wiping out hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate equity before the sun even comes up tomorrow morning. Nolan Price, who had been standing practically glued to the glass wall at the back of the room, let out a pathetic, desperate sound. She is bluffing, Nolan pleaded, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. She designed the architecture from scratch. She has to have a fail-safe built into the code. She intentionally set a trap for us to fail so she could extort the board. I slowly turned my head and fixed Nolan with a look of absolute, freezing disdain. I do not build traps. Nolan, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. I build regulatory guardrails, and I explicitly warned you about driving your car straight over them. Exactly 2 weeks ago, I sent you a formal written memorandum regarding your highly irregular request for backdoor access. I clearly stated, in writing, that any attempt to bypass the standard biometric authentication protocols would automatically trigger a temporary transfer of custodial rights to an external entity and permanently freeze all reconciliation records. I put the exact consequences directly into your inbox. I shifted my gaze back to Conrad. The patriarch of the Sloan family was staring at his vice president of operations with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He finally realized that the narrative his son had spun was a complete, fabricated lie. They had the explicit written warning. Conrad, I concluded, my voice ringing with total finality. They fully knew the catastrophic risks, but they deliberately chose to ignore the written policy. Violently break into my locked desk, steal a sealed digital asset, and blindly shove it into the core server simply because they were far too arrogant to read the terms and conditions of their own company. The power dynamic in the room fundamentally fractured and instantly resettled into a terrifying, unfamiliar new reality. Conrad Sloan slowly turned his heavy head to look at his son. Barrett physically shrank back, pressing his spine tightly against the edge of the metal console as if trying to merge with it. Conrad finally understood the truth. I had not outsmarted them with some secret, malicious coding trick. I had simply followed the strict letter of the law. His own son and his hand-picked executive enforcer had recklessly burned the company entirely to the ground out of sheer, petty spite and unchecked ego. The chief executive officer was no longer standing in the center of the room as a protective, powerful father ready to casually shield his heir from consequence. The sheer magnitude of the financial disaster had just violently shoved him into the brutal, unforgiving position of a desperate corporate survivor. As Conrad Sloan looked from the blazing red quarantine warnings on the monitors to the pale, terrified face of his own son, he realized he had been backed into a corner where he had to make an impossible, agonizing choice. He could blindly try to save his son's destroyed reputation, or he could try to save the actual mathematical survival of his life's work. He absolutely could not do both. Conrad Sloan broke the suffocating silence that had swallowed the operations room. He let out a long, ragged exhale, the distinct sound of an aging king realizing his fortress walls had just been breached from the inside. He reached up and pinched the bridge of his nose, aggressively attempting to massage away the massive, company-ending liability headache his own son had just forcefully shoved into his skull. When he finally dropped his hand and looked at me, his posture had subtly shifted. The dictatorial command of a chief executive officer was gone, replaced entirely by the strained, transactional plea of a desperate negotiator. "Reese," Conrad began, deliberately adopting a calm, perfectly reasonable tone, "let us simply put the rigid legal technicalities aside for just one moment. We are currently bleeding to death on the operating table. I am asking you to step up and temporarily assist the engineering team, help them patch the system, reverse this quarantine protocol, and get the primary network back online so things do not get any worse than they already are. Once the expansion package is safely deployed and the client is satisfied, I give you my personal, unconditional word that we will sit down privately in my office and sort out all the disciplinary paperwork." It was the oldest, most transparent corporate trap in existence. He wanted me to fix the catastrophic hole they had ripped in the hull, but he wanted me to do it completely off the record. I did not move a single inch toward the glowing server consoles. I looked at the man who had built this logistics empire and saw exactly how he intended to play the board of directors later. "I will not do that, Conrad," I replied, my voice as hard and cold as the concrete foundation beneath our feet. "If I step up to that keyboard and patch the vulnerability without a fully executed legal indemnification, I become an active participant in an undocumented system breach. Tomorrow morning, when the external auditors ask why the core infrastructure went dark, you will simply point to the digital access logs showing my credentials fixing the problem, and you will retroactively blame me for causing the outage in the first place. I will not patch your sinking ship just so you can safely throw me overboard when we reach the shore." Conrad's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together audibly in the quiet room. "What exactly do you want, Reese?" "I require 3 preliminary conditions to be met before I even consider picking up the phone to contact the external escrow agents," I stated, my demands delivered with absolute, uncompromising clarity. "First, I require a formal, legally binding memorandum drafted immediately by corporate counsel and signed by you, explicitly admitting that the custody token was physically seized from my locked desk without proper authorization, without a valid legal hold, and in direct violation of our security protocols. Second, I demand the immediate, permanent cancellation of all internal suspicion, fabricated reviews, and baseless allegations regarding my professional conduct. Third, the specific individuals who initiated this unauthorized raid must have their physical and digital access rights to the operations floor stripped entirely. Effective right this second, Barrett, who had been pressing his back against the glass wall like a trapped animal, violently pushed himself forward. The sheer panic in his chest finally boiled over into an explosive, deeply irrational rage. "You are out of your mind," Barrett shouted, his face flushing an ugly dark red as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "You are deliberately holding a billion-dollar corporation hostage over a bruised ego. You are actively leveraging technical paperwork to gain bargaining power during a critical emergency. You do not care about the medical supply chains. You just want to use this crisis to extort the executive suite and protect your own little kingdom." He desperately wanted to drag the narrative away from the cold, hard evidence and pull it down into the muddy waters of human emotion. He wanted to frame me as a petty, vindictive, and opportunistic employee. I did not engage with his screaming. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I simply let his hysterical accusation echo off the glass walls until it died a pathetic death. Then, I turned my attention smoothly to Marcus Thorne. The head of internal corporate counsel was still standing silently near the center console, his eyes locked firmly on the digital tablet in his hands. "Marcus," I said quietly, completely ignoring the heavy panting coming from Barrett. When the quarantine protocol initiated, I assumed the information technology forensics team immediately began pulling the internal communication archives for the targeted executive accounts to establish a timeline of the breach. Marcus looked up, his expression completely unreadable. Yes, the system automatically isolated and restored all deleted communications from the past 48 hours to preserve the chain of evidence. "Excellent," I replied. "Please open the audio archive folder. There should be a compressed voice note file attached to an internal messaging thread between Nolan Price and Barrett Sloan, sent at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Play the file for the room." Nolan let out a sharp, choked gasp. He lunged forward, his hands reaching out toward Marcus in a desperate, frantic bid to stop him. But the security guard positioned near the door immediately stepped into his path, placing a heavy hand squarely on Nolan's chest to hold him back. Marcus tapped the glass screen of his tablet. A second later, the crisp, digitally enhanced audio of a recorded voice note began to play over the small speaker. The sound quality was perfect, entirely stripped of any background static. It was Nolan's voice. It sounded rushed, conspiratorial, and dripping with malicious intent. "Listen to me. Do not wait for the compliance team to clear the paperwork," the recorded voice of the vice president of operations instructed. "Just get the security guard and get the token off her desk first. Grab the hardware before she comes back from the supplier meeting. If it opens the core server, we will not need her signature for the expansion rollout, and we will not need her in the building anymore." The audio file clicked off, plunging the operations room into a silence so profound and absolute it felt like the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the air. No one moved, no one spoke. The recording had just violently ripped the roof off their entire operation. There was no more room for corporate spin. There was no more space to argue about routine audits, anonymous whistleblower tips, or protecting company assets. The voice note laid their true, unvarnished motive completely bare. The illegal search of my desk was never about securing the network. It was a premeditated, coordinated theft designed entirely to seize operational control and orchestrate my termination right before the financial due diligence review. Barrett stared at the floor, his mouth hanging slightly open, his mind completely incapable of processing the fact that his own digital footprint had just signed his professional death warrant. Nolan looked as though he were about to physically collapse. his eyes wide and vacant as he realized his career was entirely over. Conrad Sloan closed his eyes. The CEO looked incredibly fragile in that moment, the immense weight of the irrefutable evidence crushing the last remaining fragments of his authority. Before anyone could attempt to break the devastating silence, a sharp, piercing, synthesized chime echoed loudly from the primary console. Every head in the room immediately snapped toward the main monitor. The blazing red quarantine warning had shrunk slightly, making room for a new, automated notification banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen. The text was stark white against a solid black background. Marcus Thorne leaned over the desk to read the notification out loud, his voice perfectly steady, but carrying the weight of a judge reading a final verdict. Automated message received from Iron Veil Fiduciary, Marcus read, his words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. Pursuant to the mandatory disaster recovery protocols, be advised that the non-compliant, hostile access attempt on the Lattice Relay Core server has been formally logged. As required by federal compliance regulations, automated notifications detailing the unauthorized internal breach have just been transmitted to the primary digital security insurance underwriters. Marcus paused, swallowing hard before reading the final sentence. Furthermore, full digital incident reports have been successfully delivered to the External Contract Advisory Board of the Palisade Care Alliance. The walls of Caldwell Meridian Logistics could no longer contain the explosion. The crisis had officially breached containment. Conrad let out a low, agonizing groan. He knew exactly what that notification meant. A few minutes ago, he still harbored a tiny, desperate hope that he could quietly manage this disaster behind closed doors, fire a few people, pay a few silent settlements, and erase the traces of his son's monumental failure. But that door had just been slammed shut and welded locked. The external world now knew. The insurance providers who backed their financial liability knew. Most importantly, the $900 million client now had documented proof that the executive leadership of this company had violently attempted to hijack a legally protected medical supply network. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or demand apologies. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of their arrogant empire unfold exactly as the underlying code dictated. The emotionless digital processes, the uncompromising attorney letters, and the irrefutable playback of their very own voices had utterly shattered them. I had merely provided the materials, and they had enthusiastically, foolishly constructed their own trap. The emergency summons went out to the executive board of directors at exactly 2:00 in the afternoon. The massive mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 15th floor, a space traditionally utilized as a grand theater for Conrad Sloan to display his absolute corporate monarchy, was rapidly transforming into a sterile, closed-door tribunal. I walked in quietly and took my assigned seat near the far corner of the expansive oak table. The atmospheric pressure in the room was crushing. For the very first time since his entirely manufactured promotion, Barrett Sloan did not stride through the heavy double doors like the inevitable, untouchable heir to the corporate throne. He walked in tentatively, his shoulders noticeably hunched inside his tailored suit, and took a seat at the extreme opposite end of the room. He looked exactly like a quarantined patient. He was no longer the golden child operating above the rules. He had officially become the bleeding epicenter of a catastrophic governance risk. The 12 members of the board of directors were heavily and visibly divided, the tense energy practically vibrating against the soundproof floor-to-ceiling windows. One specific faction, composed mostly of Conrad's older, deeply entrenched loyalist allies, desperately wanted to architect a quiet, off-the-record settlement with me behind closed doors. They whispered urgently to each other about offering lucrative stock options, extended paid sabbaticals, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements to simply make the problem vanish. The opposing faction, led by the aggressive institutional venture capitalists, who actually held the financial reins of our impending Series D funding round, possessed a completely different and far more ruthless agenda. They wanted to surgically excise Barrett from the corporate body right this exact second. They clearly understood that any hesitation, Any attempt to sweep this under the rug would allow the toxic scandal to bleed directly into the pending $900 million Palisade Care Alliance contract. Survival in a rapidly collapsing corporate hierarchy is a brutal, lightning-fast process of natural selection. When the ship begins taking on water, loyalty is always the very first cargo thrown overboard. Celia Marsh, the Senior Director of Human Resources, was the very first individual to break ranks to save herself from the firing squad. She knew her career and her unvested pension were resting squarely on the chopping block. She walked into the boardroom, her usual polished, corporate demeanor entirely shattered. Her hands were shaking so violently that the printed pages she held rattled loudly in the heavy, oppressive silence. She completely bypassed Conrad, avoiding his gaze entirely, and handed the stack of documents directly to the lead independent director. Celia had officially surrendered the complete, unedited text message thread from earlier that morning. She loudly and publicly verified to the entire room that she had explicitly asked Barrett for the legal justification to search my desk before the raid occurred. The printed reply from Barrett was damningly clear and completely legally binding. "I will handle legal later." The printed message read, "It was absolute, documented proof of premeditated negligence." Celia retreated to the back of the room, successfully transforming herself from an active co-conspirator into a manipulated victim. The avalanche of digital evidence only accelerated from there, burying the executive suite under a mountain of their own arrogance. A representative from the digital forensics team stepped forward and projected a high-contrast slide onto the main presentation screen. The Information Technology Department had successfully recovered the encrypted chat logs that Nolan Price had desperately tried to scrub from the internal operations servers just 45 minutes ago. The restored messages between the Vice President of Operations and Barrett clearly outlined their exact malicious strategy. Nolan had explicitly written, "We need to check exactly what Wallace is holding without declaring it to the audit committee." Before Barrett could even open his mouth to fabricate a creative defense for that deeply incriminating message, the head of physical security stepped up to the table and delivered the fatal, undeniable blow. He formally confirmed to the entire board that the high-definition overhead camera footage from the 14th floor definitively proved Barrett's absolute culpability. The security director stated that the video clearly showed Barrett aggressively demanding the junior human resources representative forcefully open my locked drawer, even after the representative had verbally warned him that the black graphite object inside appeared to be a sealed, highly restricted personal authentication device. The narrative of an innocent routine compliance check was completely permanently obliterated. Conrad sat perfectly rigid at the head of the oak table, his knuckles entirely white as he gripped the armrests of his heavy leather chair. He desperately tried to reassert his patriarchal authority, attempting to smooth over the jagged edges of the disaster. He tried to frame the entire horrifying sequence of events as a simple, unfortunate miscommunication between overly ambitious executives who were just trying to protect the company's intellectual property. But the room was no longer his to command. Every single new piece of evidence presented by the forensics team made the chief executive officer's position infinitely more precarious. The board members were staring at him with cold, highly calculating eyes. If Conrad continued to throw his protective, fatherly weight over his son, he was actively signaling to the venture capitalists and the external auditors that Caldwell Meridian Logistics officially condoned gross procedural violations, internal theft, and the severe mishandling of secure continuity tokens. To protect his son meant completely destroying the company's illusion of secure governance. I did not use this highly charged, pivotal moment to humiliate anyone. I did not stand up, point fingers, or deliver a passionate, vindictive speech about how I had explicitly warned them all. I simply sat perfectly still in my chair, my hands neatly folded in my lap, projecting an aura of absolute, impenetrable calm. When a board member directed a specific, technical question toward me, I answered with short, precise, and entirely factual sentences. I confirmed the exact chronological timeline of the security breach. I confirmed the rigid technical parameters of the external escrow agreement. I offered absolutely nothing else. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. My absolute frozen composure created a sharp, agonizing contrast to the sweaty, frantic, and rapidly unspooling behavior of Barrett and his shrinking faction of supporters. They were actively drowning in their own manufactured chaos, flailing wildly to find a life raft, while I simply observed them safely from the dry land of documented compliance. The lead independent director, a formidable woman who controlled the largest single block of voting shares, finally silenced the frantic murmuring in the room by tapping her heavy silver pen sharply against the polished table. She completely ignored Barrett, refusing to even acknowledge his presence in the room, and looked directly into Conrad's eyes. She articulated the exact, terrifying reality that had been silently hovering over their heads since the quarantine first initiated. If the board of directors did not handle this internal security breach with absolute, ruthless transparency and immediate, severe disciplinary action, the Palisade Care Alliance would inevitably view the incident as indisputable proof that the logistics company fundamentally lacked the basic structural governance standards required to manage a critical medical supply chain. The client was not going to tolerate a vendor where the chief executive officer's son could casually hijack the core operational network simply to settle a personal grudge. If the board showed even a fraction of a percent of leniency, the client would not just cancel the $900 million expansion, they would immediately pull their entire existing operational portfolio. That action would effectively bankrupt the logistics division within 90 days. The crisis had completely evolved. The board realized that the fundamental issue was far larger than a dispute over software access. This was a massive, existential threat to the survival of the corporation itself. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted for the final, absolute time. The battle lines were completely and permanently redrawn. Barrett Sloan slumped down deeply in his expensive, ergonomic chair, the arrogant, entitled fight entirely drained from his posture. He slowly looked around the massive oak table, finally realizing that absolutely no one was looking back at him with respect, deference, or fear. They were looking at him as a massive, infected liability that needed to be surgically amputated immediately to save the host body. The golden heir was no longer fighting a war to conquer my digital system or assert his dominance over the executive floor. The brutal, unforgiving reality of corporate survival had finally set in. Barrett was now just desperately trying to hold on to his own executive chair for a few more agonizing minutes, fully aware that the board of directors was already reaching out to forcefully pull it completely out from under him. The lead independent director called for a brief, 20-minute recess to let the staggering weight of the newly presented digital evidence settle over the room. Before I could even stand up from my chair to gather my notes, Conrad gestured toward the heavy oak doors leading directly into his private, adjoining executive suite. He did not issue a loud command. He offered a quiet invitation, wrapped entirely in the smooth, practiced diplomacy of a man who suddenly realized his brute force tactics had spectacularly failed. Inside his office, the air was thick with the heavy scent of aged leather and expensive corporate desperation. Marcus Thorne, the head of internal corporate counsel, followed us inside and stood silently by the closed door as a mandated neutral witness. Conrad did not walk around to sit behind his massive, imposing desk. Instead, he leaned casually against the front edge of it, attempting to physically lower himself closer to my level. It was an incredibly transparent psychological trick, a desperate maneuver designed to manufacture a false sense of intimacy and equality. "Reese," Conrad began, his voice meticulously dialed down to a warm, conciliatory hum. "We have clearly made some severe, highly regrettable missteps today. I will be the very first person in this building to admit that the situation on the 14th floor was handled atrociously. It was an unacceptable lapse in judgment. But right now, we are staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun, and the safety is off. I need you to help me unload it." He offered me a seat on one of the plush leather guest sofas. I declined the offer by remaining perfectly still, standing squarely in the center of the room. Here is what I am fully prepared to offer you right this exact second. Conrad continued, seamlessly shifting from hollow apologies to heavy, transactional bribery. If you walk back into that operations room, contact the external escrow agents, and authorize the immediate release of the system quarantine, I will personally guarantee your permanent elevation to the executive suite. You will be named the Chief Technology Officer by the end of the business day. I will authorize an immediate base salary increase of 75%, along with a $2 million retention bonus, paid out in full by next Friday. Furthermore, I will ensure your complete public vindication. We will issue a company-wide memorandum stating that your brilliant security protocols saved us from a critical, anonymous vulnerability test. We will handle Barrett and Nolan quietly, behind closed doors, without ever dragging your name through the mud. You get your full honor restored, and you get the compensation you truly deserve. It was, on paper, a breathtakingly generous offer. It was the exact kind of golden parachute that mid-level executives spent their entire careers aggressively fighting for. But I did not hear a promotion. I heard the distinct metallic click of a trap being carefully set. I understood the fundamental nature of corporate warfare far better than Conrad gave me credit for. The massive salary, the prestigious new title, and the hollow promise of restored honor were nothing but temporary anesthetics. They desperately needed the system back online immediately to secure the Palisade Care Alliance contract and save their impending financial valuation. If I agreed to his terms, if I patched the hole and handed the operational keys right back to the Sloan family, my leverage would instantly evaporate. They would wait for the $900 million deal to officially close, let the dust settle for 3 or 4 months, and then they would quietly terminate me for a fabricated cultural fit issue. They wanted to restore the old power structure first, then slowly and methodically bend the narrative to ensure I was entirely erased from the equation. That is a very compelling fiction, Conrad, I replied, my voice completely devoid of the eager gratitude he was fully expecting to hear. But I have absolutely no interest in returning to my desk as a subordinate employee for the exact same people who weaponized human resources and physical security to publicly raid my workspace in the middle of the afternoon. Conrad's conciliatory, paternal smile immediately tightened, the edges of his mouth pulling down into a hard, unforgiving line. Then what exactly is your price? Everyone in this building has a number. Reese? This is no longer about a paycheck or a title on a business card, I stated clearly, looking him directly in his cold, gray eyes. The fundamental trust required for an employer and employee relationship has been permanently severed. There is only one viable path forward to restore the lattice relay infrastructure to a compliant, fully operational state. The system will continue to operate, but it will do so strictly under a legally binding independent service contract with Wallace Continuity Partners, Limited Liability Company. Marcus Thorne shifted his weight nervously by the door. As the head lawyer, he understood exactly what I was proposing. I am offering to transition my entire core engineering team into a fully independent vendor entity, I explained, laying out the terms with clinical, unyielding precision. Caldwell Meridian Logistics will become our client. We will maintain the infrastructure. We will ensure the Palisade Care Alliance contract is executed flawlessly, and we will submit to rigorous, third-party auditing. But in exchange, there will be absolutely zero internal administrative backdoors, no executive overrides, no unlogged access requests. The internal management of this company will never possess the technical capability to blindly seize the steering wheel again. Conrad stared at me, the skin around his collar turning a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to reject the terms, but before he could formulate a response, the heavy oak door was violently shoved open. Barrett stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face contorted into a mask of absolute desperate fury. He had obviously been lingering in the hallway, listening through the heavy wood. "Do you hear her?" Barrett shouted, storming into the private office and pointing an accusatory, trembling finger directly at my face. "She is holding us hostage. She built a shadow company, and now she is actively trying to extort us. This is corporate espionage. She is secretly transferring company intellectual property to an outside firm for her own personal financial gain. We should have security arrest her right now." It was his final, most desperate attempt to shatter my professional credibility and drag the situation back into the muddy realm of emotional chaos. He desperately wanted his father to see me as a common thief, a rogue operator who had meticulously planned to steal the family empire out from under them. I kept my voice level, ignored his pointing finger, and turned calmly to the head of internal corporate counsel. "Marcus," I said, my tone echoing the quiet, absolute authority of a judge residing in a courtroom. "You have the master escrow agreement pulled up on your digital tablet. Please open the document to page 68 and read Exhibit 14 out loud for the room." Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second before lifting his tablet. He scrolled rapidly through the dense, legally binding text, his eyes scanning the paragraphs until he found the specific citation. "Exhibit 14, Marcus read aloud, his steady voice slicing effortlessly through Barrett's heavy, panicked breathing. "Activation of external custodial transfer. Be it known that the designated third-party risk management entity, Wallace Continuity Partners, Limited Liability Company, possesses absolutely zero proactive authority to seize, transfer, or manipulate the lattice relay intellectual property under normal operating conditions." Marcus paused, taking a deliberate, deep breath before reading the final, devastating sentence. "The transfer of operational control is a strictly dormant, automated defensive mechanism. It shall only be activated if, and only if, the primary internal continuity token is subjected to unauthorized physical seizure, or if an undocumented, non-compliant access attempt is initiated directly from within the internal Caldwell Meridian Logistics Network." The silence that crashed down on the executive office was absolute and suffocating. The words hung heavily in the air, wrapping tightly around Barrett's throat like a physical noose. The legal clause was perfectly unambiguous. The entire room instantly understood the most vital, undeniable truth of the entire day. I did not steal the company. I did not execute a hostile takeover. I possessed absolutely no technical or legal power to simply transfer the intellectual property to my own firm. The company had automatically, mechanically stripped the power away from itself. The massive loss of control was entirely self-inflicted, triggered exclusively by the arrogant, reckless actions of Barrett and Nolan. They had meticulously engineered the precise framework of their own undeniable downfall, positioned themselves squarely in the center of the trap, and enthusiastically sealed their own fate. We returned to the main conference room in absolute silence. When Conrad and Marcus formally relayed the rigid terms of my proposal and the stark, undeniable reality of Exhibit 14 to the waiting board of directors, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally shifted. Several of the older, loyalist board members who had previously been hesitant, who had desperately wanted to protect the Sloan family legacy, now leaned entirely in my direction. They were seasoned corporate survivors, and they recognized an impossible situation when they saw one. They knew that the absolutely only viable formula to save the $900 million medical supply contract, and by extension, the entire enterprise, was to swallow their pride and accept the new, independent operational structure. Attempting to drag the power dynamic back to the old corrupted order would result in total, immediate financial annihilation. The lead independent director, recognizing that the executive suite was completely paralyzed by their own failure, took definitive control of the meeting. She formally scheduled a final, binding vote for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to officially approve the transition to the independent service contract and to finalize the severe disciplinary actions regarding the internal security breach. As the meeting adjourned and the exhausted board members began filing out of the room, Barrett remained glued to his leather chair. He looked desperately at his father, his eyes silently pleading, still fiercely clinging to the childish delusion that Conrad would somehow deploy a miracle to save him from falling publicly. But Conrad did not meet his son's gaze. The chief executive officer simply gathered his files and walked out, looking exactly like a man who had just attended his own funeral. The audience in the room understood perfectly. The shouting was over, the forensic evidence was permanently logged, and the true climax of the story had just been pushed directly to the terrifying edge of the cliff, waiting only for the sun to rise. The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 15th floor boardroom at exactly 8 o'clock, but it offered absolutely no warmth to the men sitting across from me. The final meeting did not begin with pleasantries, hollow apologies, or standard corporate jargon. It began with the cold, unforgiving blade of a comprehensive forensic audit. The lead independent legal counsel, brought in specifically overnight by the venture capital faction, stood at the head of the heavy oak table. She held a thick-bound dossier that represented the complete, mathematical dismantling of Barrett Sloane's brief, disastrous executive career. She read the timeline aloud, enunciating every single syllable with the clinical precision of a medical examiner determining a cause of death. She detailed the exact minute the fabricated anonymous tip was generated from Nolan Price's secondary network account. She read the empty, completely blank chain of approval logs into the official corporate record. She highlighted the exact timestamp when Barrett blindly shoved the physical custody token against the biometric reader, and she recited the cascading system failure warnings that instantly followed. Every single deleted email, every recovered text message, and every frantic attempt to scrub the internal servers was laid completely bare. Barrett had spent his entire privileged life operating under the arrogant assumption that he could simply explain things away later, that his father's vast shadow would eventually cover his mistakes. As the independent counsel read the final page of the forensic report, that delusion permanently shattered. The digital paper trail had transformed his careless entitlement into an unbreakable concrete wall that no amount of family money could penetrate. When the counsel finally closed the heavy folder, a suffocating silence fell over the room. The lead independent director turned her gaze toward me. She respectfully asked if I had any final statements to add to the official record before the board commenced the formal disciplinary voting process. I did not stand up. I did not deliver a passionate, vindictive monologue about justice, professional respect, or corporate responsibility. I simply looked directly across the wide expanse of the mahogany table, locking my eyes entirely on Barrett, and I repeated the exact same string of words that had violently drained the color from the 14th floor 24 hours ago. Who signed the chain of custody exception to seize the custody token from my desk? The question hung heavily in the air, echoing softly against the soundproof glass walls. Absolutely no one answered. The silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply satisfying. It was the naked, undeniable truth filling the room. There was no exception. There was no legal loophole. That singular, gaping void of authorization became the final fatal strike that completely killed any lingering attempt at a defense. The executions were swift and entirely devoid of emotion. Nolan Price was formally terminated right there in his ergonomic chair. His lucrative employment contract was instantly voided for cause, explicitly citing gross misconduct, the malicious fabrication of an internal corporate whistleblower report, the creation of a fraudulent justification to illegally seize a legally protected security device, and the deliberate attempt to manipulate the core routing access logs prior to an external financial audit. He was not even permitted to return to his corner office to collect his personal belongings. 2 physical security guards, the exact same men he had utilized to intimidate me the day before, escorted him directly out of the boardroom and down to the ground floor lobby. Barrett Sloane did not fare much better. The board of directors systematically stripped him of every single piece of executive authority he possessed. They formally revoked his access to the strategic planning committees. They permanently severed his administrative system rights, and they forced his immediate, unconditional resignation from the position of Executive Vice President of Strategy. It was the absolute only viable sacrifice the board could offer to appease the external auditors and mathematically guarantee the survival of the impending $900 million expansion deal. Barrett tried to look at his father one last time, his eyes silently begging for a miraculous intervention, but Conrad Sloane kept his gaze firmly glued to the polished wood of the table. The patriarch of Caldwell Meridian Logistics had finally run out of maneuvers. With his son publicly exiled and his vice president of operations fired for cause, Conrad was forced to accept the exact, rigid operational terms he had desperately tried to avoid just yesterday. He slowly picked up his heavy gold fountain pen and signed his name to the newly drafted, multi-year master service agreement. Caldwell Meridian Logistics was officially legally bound to Wallace Continuity Partners Limited Liability Company. I was no longer an easily intimidated, subordinate employee vulnerable to the sudden whims of a spoiled heir. I returned to the operations floor as the undisputed, fully independent authority over the logistics infrastructure. The exact moment the formal admission of the procedural violation, the strict new third-party oversight structure, and the ironclad non-retaliation clauses were fully executed and digitally stamped, I opened my laptop. I sent a single, encrypted authorization message to Iron Veil Fiduciary. Within exactly 10 minutes, the external custodians verified the new legal framework and released the digital hold. The lattice relay architecture hummed back to life. The cascading red warning banners vanished from the operations monitors, replaced instantly by the soothing, continuous scroll of green medical transit data. We had successfully salvaged the Palisade Care Alliance expansion package with less than 4 hours remaining before the catastrophic, company-ending contract violation would have permanently triggered. The final, most expensive victory of the entire ordeal did not happen in the boardroom. However, it happened later that afternoon, when I finally walked back down the long central aisle of the 14th floor. The massive bullpen was quietly humming with standard operational activity, but a distinct, highly respectful hush fell over the immediate area as I approached my workspace. My desk was sitting in the exact same spot it had always occupied. Nothing about the physical furniture had changed. Yet, as I sat down in my chair and smoothly unlocked my bottom right pedestal drawer, the fundamental reality of the entire corporate empire had permanently shifted around it. From that day forward, absolutely no one in the building ever dared to step too close to my workspace. No one ever thought about touching a single folder, a notebook, or a locked drawer belonging to me ever again. Barrett Sloan had foolishly spent his entire life believing that absolute power was simply a physical object you could inherit, steal, or forcefully demand from others. I had proven that true, unbreakable control belongs exclusively to the person who actually understands the architecture of the system, who maintains absolute professional discipline, and who knows that asking just one precisely timed, perfectly calm question is entirely enough to make a massive, multi-billion-dollar empire completely lose its color. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know exactly where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I highly invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by liking this video so this story can be heard by many more people.